Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today. The A Fork in Time Wayback Changing History vehicle is quite full. We had to bring the minivan version today, I think. So I think we're in pretty good shape. So I'm in the driver's seat, but I'm joined today in no significant order. By the way, this is a Don pet peeve, so I'm going to mention it now. Watching shows like American Idol and other things where they're announcing folks and they say in no particular order, you're about to announce people in an order. So it is a particular order. It's just no significant order. There's a difference between the two. So in no significant order, just the way Zoom has us organized here, I've got Eric Darling Bond. Eric is actually the person who suggested the episode. So good to see you, EDB.
Good to be here. I'm in the trunk of the minivan.
No, we got the big one. We go 3 full seats going back. We're in good shape.
Oh, okay. Great.
I've got Dr. Eric Rush enjoying his favorite A Fork in Time recording beverage. I will just leave it at that. So good to see you, Dr. Rush.
Good to see you too, Don. I am strapped at the top of the minivan.
Oh, reference to pre-recording off-air things. So that was sort of good. Dylan Holzheimer, who is our resident attorney and will come in handy today. But even more than that, he's a musician and he's a really cool guy. So good to have you, Dylan. How are you today?
Doing good. I just have to try and actually sound like I really do practice law instead of just doing dirt law like I usually do every day.
Fake it till you make it, Dylan. That's what I say.
Exactly.
Fake it till you make it. And of course, I'm joined by now number 2 on the all-time list of podcast appearances by percentage. That probably means by time too as well, Chris. That's Chris Coppola. Chris, would you say hi to the good people?
Hi, good people. Although they
right.
don't even let me in the minivan, I'm in the little sidecar beside it.
There's a U-Haul that we're towing behind. That's all I'm saying at the end of the day. So it's good to have the crew here together today. This is episode 199. And so I'm going to go ahead and mention right now, what comes after 199 is 200. What comes after 200 for Fork in Time is our decision to have our second live stream, which we're all getting real excited about. We were talking in pre-show off podcast here about that. So that's going to be on Saturday, May 11th. It's going to be at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 4 p.m. Central Time. Seems like an odd time. That's why we chose the weekend, but that's also to make it so that it's not extremely, extremely late for our European listeners. They can stay up a little bit late on Saturday. We have a pretty good contingent of listeners that we know are down under in Australia and New Zealand. So we wanted to give them a chance if they're willing to wake up early on a Sunday and pick us up there. But we're looking forward to it. I certainly encourage you to follow the links in the show notes. Which will take you to the website, which lets you know what's going on there, but also to visit our Discord channel that's devoted to this. So if you're not participating on Discord yet, go there because that's the main place that we are accepting nominations for the live stream. What do you mean nominations for the live stream? Well, here's what we're going to do, among other things in the live stream, is we're going to do an episode live. And what that means is we're not going to know which episode we're actually doing until we actually get into the episode. Now, we'll have the advantage of 4 or 5, so we'll be able to do research and be a little bit prepared and have some thoughts, but you're going to see us live. And what you'll actually see in that, if you join the live stream, what you will see is a little bit example of what we just got through doing here for this episode, what we do before, talk a little bit about potential trajectories and what we may talk about and try to keep it organized. You'll see that. And then we will say, and now we're starting that. You'll hear me count in like I do, like these guys here, starting the episode in 3, 2, 1, and then we'll go. If you don't catch the live stream, you will not hear that because what we publish will actually just be the episode. So just be aware of that. So that's one of the advantages of going to the live stream. Yeah, you'll be able to catch the live stream on YouTube. I know I can't keep it from you in terms of after the fact, but encourage you to be there and encourage you to participate. We're looking forward to it. There'll be some other things. There will be a Fork in Time team member bingo. We'll explain what that is and where you can go and get your bingo cards and what's there. And we will have, just because we have to do it, we will have at least a couple of minutes devoted at the end of the live stream for the continuation of the Great Barbecue Debate, because we have to. It's just part of who we are and how we're built. But that's not what we're doing today. Today, what we're doing is the topic that Eric suggested, which is both timely and goes back in time at the same time. So the reason it's timely is we're going to be talking about presidential pardons. Yes, I said presidential pardons, which may touch indirectly into presidential immunity. So let me just say right up front, we know we can't dodge current real world events, nor should we, nor we're going to try here. But we're really going to try to focus what we're doing on the past event, which is sort of a similar thing to this. And so the alternative timeline today is what would have happened if Gerald Ford had not pardoned Richard Nixon. And so we'll definitely talk about what Nixon even needed a pardon for, what would have happened as a result of not having a pardon in place. So we'll end up talking about some things that are relevant and tangential to current U.S. American jurisprudence in 2024 that involves presidents and ex-presidents. But we're mainly going to be talking about, sadly, this is a very poor thing for Gerald Ford. Anytime I say Gerald Ford, I see Gerald Ford, and sadly, I see Chevy Chase in the SNL version of Gerald Ford at the same time. And that really is a sad thing for Gerald Ford because he deserves a better fate than Chevy Chase's portrayal of him that we see there. So, but that just runs through my head, just so you know what's happening here. So the concept of the historical what did, of course, is by the time we reach August of 74, things are starting to roll along. Dylan, I'm going to hand it over to you a little bit to talk a little bit about how things are building up to this event, sort of what has happened, and where are we to the point when Gerald Ford actually decides, okay, I'm going to issue this pardon, and what is a pardon, and what does it do, and what does it not do, kind of thing.
Yeah, so summer of 74 is very exciting and very nerve-wracking for Nixon and a lot of his sort of close guys. Nixon resigns in August of 74. The whole summer prior to that, he's been having to deal with the fallout from the Watergate break-in. In March, the main 7 guys are indicted, so their prosecution is moving along. You've got basically it's all anybody who's into politics can talk about. All the President's Men, the famous book about the whole thing, is published in June. Nixon is fighting his immunity and executive privilege argument over some of the tapes in the Supreme Court. So basically, it's just all Nixon all the time. And in this instance, no news is definitely good news, which is not what Nixon is getting right now. So he, in August, is basically up against the wall, and his entire team is basically saying, look, you have to resign, or you can try and fight the impeachment that Congress started right at the end of July, and just see if you've got a chance to win it. Basically, they say those are your 2 options. You can bow out as gracefully as you still can at present, or you can try and fight it, take it to the mat, and just pray to God that luck ends up with you, which, to be perfectly frank, the odds are not great. So that's the situation and the lay of the land when Gerald Ford pardons Nixon, or right before he resigns and then pardons Nixon. But the pardon itself is actually kind of interesting because there's a perception of a kind of corrupt bargain, and it's also a very oddly phrased pardon, because we kind of started talking about this before the podcast got going, but it's worded very broadly. It's basically any crimes that Nixon either did commit or may have committed. So it goes broader than just saying, hey, he hasn't been indicted yet, even though he is named as an unindicted co-conspirator in some of the other indictments. They basically say, Gerald Ford says, whatever you might have done, we kind of vaguely know what it might have been, but we're just going to say it's all cool. You're good. You're pardoned for whatever it might have been. And Nixon just goes on his merry way. And now we have to talk about how Gerald Ford is left to clean up the mess.
Yeah. So the resignation is August, I think August 8 of 74, if I remember correctly. The pardon is September 8 of 74. I was just looking at that to make sure I had the timeline back. So we're talking about a 1 month into the Ford accidental, weird, never been elected even to the vice presidency because he was appointed to be the vice president election. So 1 month into the Ford presidency, this happens. And so one of the tricky parts here about when we say there's not going to be is we don't have much of a real timeline Ford presidency to contemplate before this event happens. So it becomes incredibly speculative about what the remainder of the Ford presidency is. And I know for a fact we'll end up talking about the 76 election here because it will lead towards that. But just, that timeline, just to get everybody, back straight, good summary there, Dylan, was helpful for me. I remember the one thing, I remember when Nixon resigned, they interrupted my cartoons when I was a kid, so it made me a little bit upset. But not fully understanding as a 6-year-old what was going on here. But I hadn't realized the timing on how tight that was. I guess I did, but hadn't refreshed myself about what it meant. And the other thing that I was doing during some of the pre-show research was, again, the idea of, what was the impact of this? Ford's approval ratings are very high when he first assumes the office. 71% presidential approval that's a big number. That is a big, big number. You can look at a lot of popular presidents riding the high points, riding the zeniths of their presidential popularity, and that's the ballpark that you're in. Afterwards, not so much. It drops by approximately 20 percentage points, directly attributable to the pardon. So obviously it was an impactful thing. So Don's talked for a good bit there. I'm going to open the floor up to anybody who has some initial thoughts they want to throw out.
So it's interesting to me that it dropped so precipitously, and it's not something we on the podcast really knew. We all had the impression that there was a reaction to this, but maybe not quite as prominent a one. And this is always something that gives us a very nice point of departure when there are really discrete events, a specific event that has a specific effect.
Right.
And this is definitely one of those. And I was certainly shocked when Don sent that out because I was not alive in 1974, and so there was no cartoons for me to have interrupted, so I didn't know any of this. It makes it very fertile ground for us to decide what to do next.
I was not born until 1995, since we're playing the birthday game, Dr. Rush. But I did have a cartoon. It was Pinky and the Brain, where Brain says, "After I take over the world, I will resign and have Gerald Ford pardon me." So before I ever even knew Gerald Ford was president, I know that he had pardoned somebody.
So one of the questions that I have, Dylan, back to the thing you were talking about there about what's unique about the pardon. We were talking about this a little bit off podcast in the sense of it. I remember it being, basically for any crimes, because again, part of it was the things that they knew, but there was the concern, I guess, about the things they didn't know. And so what good would the pardon be, or how many pardons would Ford have to issue, right? Or subsequent folks have to issue beyond this particular thing. So again, that broad nature of the pardon, Dylan, I'm just going to ask this question. It is a pardon. And the pardon power is definitely within the enumerated powers of the presidency. So that's not one of the areas in the current contention of law. Now, whether a president can pardon himself is a whole other thing that's been raised because of current events. But the presidential pardon is an enumerated right in the Constitution, so there's no doubt about that. But I guess where I'm going is the idea, this pardon is so broad, isn't sort of a quasi post fact immunity almost, kind of, in terms of the way that it actually operates.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why it was worded that way, is because the whole point of it was to, put a book into the whole Watergate thing that had been taking over the public's imagination, for months and months. The idea basically is if you word it broad enough, then whatever you're possibly going to investigate Nixon for, that he's been pardoned about the Watergate stuff. So let's just drop it. But yeah, pardons are kind of an interesting, thankfully, not really super established precedent when you start looking at it. And once you start really getting to the high level like this, the pardon doesn't have to be for anything that has been convicted, even though that's usually where we experience it. You can pardon somebody who's been indicted of something. And as we know from Nixon, you can pardon somebody who hasn't even been indicted. The president has two requirements. It's got to be a person. You have to identify somebody or a group of people who are going to be pardoned. And the only real rule on what the scope of what he can pardon for is he can't pardon state crimes because that's a state constitutional issue. And he can't run afoul of another constitutional provision. So other than that, the text of the Constitution says he basically can do whatever. So this is what starts to get you into some of the accusations that Ford ends up getting after he does the Nixon pardon, because people start accusing him of a sort of corrupt bargain with Nixon to say, hey, I'm going to let Nixon bow out, and then I'm going to be the president, the sort of man behind the curtain, which makes Ford out to be a little more nefarious than I think anybody really is comfortable thinking of Ford as being. But
just to establish the quid pro quo here,
yeah,
because a lot of people may not know about it. First Marylander ever elected on a national ticket had to resign because of tax evasion. That was Spiro Agnew. So Spiro Agnew was elected as vice president in 68 and again in 72. The only reason Gerald Ford is in this position to make this decision is because Richard Nixon selected him as his vice president when Agnew resigned. So the argument is there was some collusion, some communication, because at the time that Agnew resigned, Watergate was out there. So there's an understanding made between Nixon and Ford. I will appoint you, Ford, vice president. When I resign, you take over. And for making you president, in effect, you're going to pardon me for Watergate. I just wanted to make very clear.
Yeah, that's
getting what from that bargain.
That's what it looks like. Yeah.
Yeah.
And but I will say it wasn't just Nixon that sort of drafted Ford, right?
Yeah, no, it was basically the entirety of Congress, because he was the minority speaker.
Yeah,
or the minority leader.
He was
they forced Nixon to pick him, basically.
He was palatable to everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, and
he was the most popular man in Washington, D.C., essentially, at the time. Yeah. And that was kind of his chief quality that Nixon did and did not like about him, was that he was popular.
Well, and he wasn't one of Nixon's guys. You know, you knowing what we now know about Nixon, you kind of get the sense that he and Spiro Agnew, even had they not been president and vice president, probably would have kind of hung out in the same circles just as a basic, quality of character kind of thing. Ford is probably, if you look up in the dictionary what the ideal sort of Boy Scout is, Gerald Ford's picture is going to be there. He's just sort of a paragon of a different world to Nixon, which is why he was picked, but also ironic in that, he arguably did what the nation needed in hindsight, but at the time, a lot of people would have seen this as, obstruction or, some nefarious plot, when really all Ford was trying to do was just to get everybody to move on.
In fact, I think
Ford is the only Eagle Scout to be president, by the way.
And to that point, Dylan, I think you explained it well and hit it well. Is the idea there that it's because of that he chooses to do this thing, which is going to torpedo his elective political career, and it's the idea of, well, this is the right thing to do. I know it's going to be unpopular and questioned. And, then you mentioned the nefarious, was there some type of quid pro quo behind the scenes deal that was done? It's never come to light if it was, and we find it doubtful for all the reasons we were just talking about, the character of who's involved there. But it's because of that, he does the right thing. And because he does the right thing, he gets the punishment for having, done the quote unquote, in his mind, the right thing. Interesting things I read in the research was that he carried with him some newspaper article or magazine, something in his wallet all the time, where basically he was talking about the fact that the nature of a pardon means that what I think was mentioned. I think it was mentioned on podcast. If not, it was mentioned in our conversation before. Is that it's sort of even if you're pardoned for it, it's the understanding you're essentially saying you did it, even though you're not going to have to face the consequences of it, right?
You're accepting a pardon.
Right.
Yeah, basically, it's from a Supreme Court case. Nobody's actually super sure whether it's really what that means or if the Supreme Court was just kind of talking about it, because they do that. Spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't read a Supreme Court opinion. But yeah, he carried it around basically for the rest of his life and just said, I knew that Nixon was going to have to admit that he did it, basically, which is how he kind of justified it to himself. What's interesting, though, is and I actually found this out in the research. The National Archives released some of the stuff from the investigation leading up to, the Watergate decision and the pardon. And actually, especially for any lawyers out there who are listening to this, it is kind of a fascinating memo. Basically, it's a memorandum that functions as really a draft indictment of Nixon for all of this stuff. And Nixon, there's arguments that he could be convicted of conspiracy on every single crime that all of the other people in Watergate were indicted or convicted of, and the underlying offenses. So not just the conspiracy to defraud, commit perjury, obstruct a criminal investigation, conspiracy to bribe, but all of those actual offenses too. So had Gerald Ford not pardoned Nixon, you're looking at probably the most sensational trial, politically speaking, of the 20th century, just from the sheer amount of stuff that the Justice Department would be alleging that a president had done. So it's, the magnitude of what Ford kept us from seeing is kind of hard to overstate. I mean, it's not quite to the level of, the president actively killing someone on like TV or something, but shy of that, it's hard to overstate exactly what the nation would have to go through.
And Dylan, walk us through a little bit about what's required for conspiracy, because conspiracy is always one of those sort of funny crimes that, you can do the same thing, and in some cases it's not a conspiracy, and some cases it is a conspiracy. So can you walk us through some of the vagaries of what conspiracy means in the US?
So conspiracy is, the general gist of it is basically anytime two people plan to do something, it's a conspiracy. Mm-hmm. And the conspiracy to do what is usually the question. So it's the conspiracy itself. A lot of times they will just think of it as kind of like an accessory after the fact charge, an aiding and abetting charge. Basically, a conspiracy criminal charge gets thrown at pretty much anybody who's involved in the planning or the commission of the crime, just as it's almost kind of an afterthought, because usually you're going to charge them. But the short gist of it is it's two or more people planning to commit a certain illegal act, or even just to commit a crime in general. It doesn't have to be a specific crime. It can just, you and I could sit in a room and say, hey, we're going to do criminal things. Strictly speaking, that is a criminal conspiracy. So it's kind of a catch-all that's incredibly vague, but also sometimes requires some very specific intent, like to commit certain crimes, obstruction of justice or obstruction of a criminal investigation, for example. Not only would you have to plan the obstruction, you would also have to intend that what you're going to do is actually obstruct. You can't say, oh, we're going to plan a surprise birthday party for, our friend Don, and then the surprise birthday party just so happens to be right in front of the doors that the Justice Department was about to go through when they go arrest somebody. That's not going to cut it for conspiracy to obstruct a criminal investigation. But it's one of those things that, depending on what conspiracy you're accused of doing, you could either have just chit-chatted with somebody on the street or on the phone about something, or you could have sat in a smoky back room, plotting the end of the world with the Illuminati. It basically covers the entire gamut.
And by the way, that's what I want my surprise birthday party to be, is the Illuminati plotting the fall of the world. That's the theme I want to go for if we do that.
I think that sounds good. I mean, I've already got those decorations, Don.
There you go.
Wait, and just a clarification. Are we going with Illuminati like the original one with Adam Weishaupt, where they're the perfectibilists and it's a Freemason thing? Or are we going with the Illuminati as used by Rosicrucians?
No, this is full bore sovereign citizens, baby.
That's
Yeah.
where I was about,
We're
that's where I
going
was
off
about
the
to go,
wall.
Dylan. I was about to go. Sovereign
I'm getting
citizens.
license plates for everybody.
Oh, nice.
I'll bring everybody a copy of Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So to keep ourselves on one of the many tracks that we could go on here, and there's all kinds of fun ones to go. We can go around the traffic circle here and pick any one to veer off onto. Let's focus on the legal part, and then we'll come back to the political part for Ford. So one of the things we talked about off podcast, Dylan, we were trying to figure out what the timing would be for this to happen. As you mentioned, there's already been the indictments of the actual folks who did the break-in and some of the others that were involved in that. So there are criminal proceedings that are moving forward. There's been the question, there's the known existence of the tapes. And so there's the question about, who can get a hold of these tapes? Who do they belong to? Who may have accidentally recorded 18 minutes or accidentally deleted 18 minutes or so, and all the other stuff that goes with that. But we have a situation here without the pardon, particularly without the broad pardon, that as far as we understand it, this is also a question that's implied today, but the theory would be that they had drafted that memo that you referred to there, that essentially, as you said, was the
draft indictment, basically.
The draft indictment for all intents and purposes. And once Nixon has resigned, I think most of us, the way we've understood this to be all along, although new interpretations are coming along day by day now, is that then he's subject to the actual criminal process. So an actual indictment versus this being some type of referral to Congress, to the House, to bring proceedings and then leading to a trial in the Senate. Are we agreed anyway? At least at that time, that's the way most people thought that would go down before the pardon.
Yeah.
The House was holding impeachment hearings.
Right.
And what triggered his resignation was, if you can actually believe this, at one point, there were Republicans that were actually willing to vote to impeach a Republican president.
Yeah.
And some of them went to Nixon and said, we are not behind you. You do not have the votes in the House. They will vote to impeach you. And that was the meeting that triggered the resignation on August 4th.
Right. So assuming that Nixon still resigns in face of the impeachment process, which is a political process to remove you from office, then the assumption is that document or something like it, Dylan, turns into the formal type of thing that you see as an indictment. And then we have Nixon going through all the things that a criminal defendant goes through that's been indicted, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So basically Nixon gets, he resigns. That removes the sort of unofficial Justice Department prohibition on prosecution. So basically the light is green if they decide to take it. You also have to remember that all of his co-conspirators basically, if they wanted to prosecute him, they already have the track getting laid for him, because it's, I'm looking at the timeline here. Haldeman, I know, and a couple of the others get convicted in their trials on New Year's Day, 1975. Mm-hmm. So a lot of this is, and once you have a conviction of one person in a conspiracy, it's all public record. It's fair game to use again for another prosecution. So you're probably looking at, the wheel starting to gear up over Christmas. Everybody's Thanksgiving is even worse than it was in our real timeline with the political discussions over Thanksgiving 1974 and Christmas 74. And you start seeing the trial, get ready, your jury selection, your discovery, all the news is going to be about it into the spring of 75, right as you start dealing with some of the political wheels moving for the inevitability of the next election cycle.
Okay.
Is what's going to end up happening. Is
Citizen Nixon now indicted, potentially Citizen Nixon at this point, for the other folks that have been indicted and in some cases now convicted by this point? Can he be compelled to testify?
Yes and no. He can be compelled to testify, but you also have to remember that he has the Fifth Amendment right, and you can't force anybody to violate their Fifth Amendment right. So you can force him to show up to court, but anything that he potentially could say that could get him into trouble for his own trial, he could literally sit up there and just, they could have him scheduled to testify for 2 days, and he could for 2 straight days say, "I plead the Fifth."
So
and he's going to take 5 on all of this.
Yeah, of course.
yeah, so I'm thinking now, this is again what would have been playing out with the the courtroom sketch artists, because we don't have cameras in the courtrooms kind of thing here. But this idea of, let's say he's been caught, let's just pick one. Let's say it's Haldeman's trial, there's one example here. Let's say that he's, called to testify because they just really want to put the clinchers on here, and also starting to set up, as you say, the other things that tie him, the conspiracy case, is tying all these things together and putting a thread through them. Is that, can he just show up and say, "I'm not testifying to anything," a blanket Fifth, or does he actually have to take the stand and invoke the Fifth every time there's a question asked?
He has to actually sit there. Yeah. Okay. It's not one of those things, because you don't know what question they're going to ask, and you can only use the Fifth Amendment as an avoidance of incrimination. So for all he knows, they could ask him, "What was the weather on Tuesday?"
Right. And so that's the other reason that, you see criminal defendants who can't be compelled to testify against themselves rarely put on the stand by their smart attorneys, because they know that that's how it's going to go down. And, I know you're trying to convict me. I refuse to answer that because it might convict me, kind of thing, which is a problem. Right. And so what you would have seen outplayed in the media there, which is why I asked this question, is you would have seen these other trials going along, and the nightly news would have started with, and once again today, President Nixon, when asked question A, B, C, D through quadruple Z, pled the Fifth Amendment. And so even if you aren't guilty, the impression is, well, you're hiding something, right? Otherwise, you would answer the question. And so this would be how it would play out outside of his own trial. But certainly then you would have whatever happened in his own trial.
And then I'm imagining President Ford at press conferences, being asked about this and having to say over and over again, look, this is the justice system. Like, I am not interfering with the justice system. I'm letting things happen the way they are supposed to happen. This is the way this goes in this country. Nobody is above the law.
Yeah. And so that probably,
I imagine he would probably say something to the fact that he said when he was inaugurated, of saying, like, "I'm very keenly aware that I was not elected, nor have I ever sought the presidency." I can imagine that he reiterates that, of like, "As someone who had never sought the presidency but was raised to this position, it is not my place to then pardon
right
for crimes in something that could be made to look like quid pro quo."
Yeah, especially given Ford's perception in Congress and sort of in the public eye. He's basically, I don't want to say the goody two shoes, but that's exactly what I'm going to say, of Washington. There's a decent argument that says he doesn't want to be anywhere near this. Even if it's his president, he doesn't want to have anything to do with this toxic situation that he could embroil himself in. And
in retrospect, I think the truth is, I think President Ford was, as far as politicians go, I think he was a pretty honest guy.
And you could argue that one of the reasons for the pardon is so that he doesn't have to every day, at the start of anything else of substance that's being discussed. And there's other things of substance going on in the world. Let's be clear about that. He doesn't have to deal with that every day.
What do you think about the trial today, President Ford?
Yeah. So just the practical aspects of that. So now we get Nixon. Let's say Nixon goes to trial on whatever he's been actually indicted on. At your point, Dylan, that could be, more things could be discovered, or certainly there can be the conspiracy, and then him actually being tried for the acts because of what's going on there. We were talking about the timeline for that probably coincides with the 76 election, right? If not before, it could easily fall during the 76. Election cycles, by the way, used to be much shorter than the forever that constantly start immediately after the previous election at that time. But certainly by the time you're into 76, you're into the primary season and everything that's going on. So the election is real.
Yeah. At the very least, it's going to impact the primary season. depending on how the delay tactics go, he may or may not, be starting trial or in the middle of trial when the election's going on. But even if it's just during the primaries, I mean, let's be honest, it's going to be on the front of everybody's minds, especially with it being Nixon, being who Nixon is, being, I mean, probably this is the most sensational, political scandal, much less criminal scandal, since what, Teapot Dome, so it's just a huge thing for everybody to talk about.
It may be checkers.
Oh,
or
seeds.
Or
Planting seeds.
Fala getting rescued from the Aleutians in World War II.
Yeah.
Stay tuned for future presidential dog episodes that we were talking about off podcast. That's a little nugget for you guys that have stuck with us for.
That's a potential arc for us.
Yeah, but yeah, I think basically the long and the short of it is this trial and this criminal process. It's going to be the first thing that pretty much anybody thinks of, at least through the end of 1976, when anybody utters the words Republican Party. It's just, whether anybody had anything to do with it or not, it's just going to be an inescapable reality. So I think you're going to see it kind of craft some of the discussions around who's going to end up being the front runner, who's going to be on the ticket, whether, everybody's immediate Republican bona fides while this trial is going on is going to be, oh, well, Richard Nixon hated me. That's basically going to be their litmus test for, especially future congressmen and things like that, is whoever is the farthest away from Nixon's inner circle is going to be the best choice.
Yeah. Well, also not to mention, I'm curious do you guys think that this would have affected who became the Democratic nominee? Because Jimmy Carter kind of painted himself as like, I am the anti-Nixon. And I think that really helped him out, especially a lot when Ford had in our timeline pardoned Nixon to make it look like I am the opposite of these insider guys. I'm just a peanut farmer who saw a UFO.
And was governor of Georgia. I remember Carter running again as an 8-year-old. I remember Carter running as an outsider. I remember that being constantly talked about. He's not. I didn't know what the term inside the Beltway meant at the time. I don't think it was probably used, but certainly that was the impression, is that he's not a creature of Washington. He's a governor. So he's not a senator. He's not a congressman. He's not, and that had been the path so often for those that had achieved the office, was to be in some federal office before. But to Eric's point, what do we think it does to Ford sliding away from the Nixon and the legal side of this? We can come back to it if we want to. What does this look like for Ford? Not answering questions about Nixon's trial, but just look like for Ford's presidency from August of 74 on to the election in 76. I mean, how is it different if he hasn't issued the pardon?
I would say, I think the chief thing is that because of the legal drama, it does free up Ford to act more unilaterally on issues that he might have been concerned about having to balance out between, like, the guy who pardoned Nixon today really screwed things up in Saigon, for instance. Whereas you could say, when you have a lot of legal issues going on, you are kind of more freed to act unilaterally on issues that aren't going to be reported about. One of them being like, Ford in our timeline was able to pass special education funding across the country, and that was a pretty big deal. It didn't get reported on a lot about, but it happened.
So I guess
I don't know where I'm trying to go with this point.
I do we think that he's going to focus more on, domestic policy, because he can pivot back to his history as saying, hey, look, I was in Congress. I've only really been dealing with Nixon for 2 years at this point. Like, I don't know. I guess what I'm getting at is, if he's going to try to avoid Nixon, which we're assuming that he's avoiding Nixon talk with the trial, does he pivot to, I'm a domestic policy expert. I've got the special education. He's a big advocate of the Equal Rights Amendment, which I learned today. That was kind of interesting. Does that
and also
have
Roe v. Wade.
Yeah,
He was a
and
big supporter of that.
that's slightly
After
more
the
checkered.
fact, he was a
after
supporter.
slightly more checkered, but yeah, so does he do that side of things? Does he try and say, "Hey, look, I'm a big domestic policy guy because I've been in Congress, I've been working for the betterment of the country," or does he just say, "You know what? All the news back to the States is going to be a 20 questions that inevitably turns back to Nixon. Do I just go foreign policy instead?"
Yeah,
And I honestly don't know. Which do you think?
I think he probably does a little, or I think he feels free to do a little more of the foreign policy, knowing that his challenge in the primary is going to be from Reagan on the conservative side, and that was a hard fought battle. That was not a he was not guaranteed to win that. There is a case to be made in a different episode. I mean, maybe a different episode for Reagan being the Republican nominee in 76 instead of 80. So I think you have Ford having fairly moderate domestic policy chops, having to rely maybe a little bit more, or being able to rely a little bit more on foreign policy experience, of which Reagan had really none.
The question I would ask is, what's going on in the world in 74, 75, 76 that's going to allow realistically Ford to put his imperator on anything? And the big things going on, I would argue, are Spain and Portugal decolonizing. And I forget whether it was on podcast or off podcast, getting a fun little argument as to who's responsible for Vietnam. I'll tell you right now, what Ford doesn't want is to be responsible for Angola.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, do you guys think that Ford, as part of his cleaning up the presidency, in there was the Halloween massacre, as it's called, where he basically cleared out a lot of Nixon's cabinet, save for Henry Kissinger. Do we think he even keeps Kissinger now?
I think Kissinger is one of those people that just can't leave the White House. He put some Horcruxes in the Lincoln bedroom, and you can kick him out. He's just going to show back up.
I'm picturing, I think some of us have seen that Simpsons meme of Moe throwing Barney out of the bar, and he just keeps coming back. I'm going to Photoshop Kissinger onto that. I'll tell you guys that right now.
And I mean, say what you will. I mean, Kissinger is like the Republican foreign policy guy for 40 years. So if anybody's going to get kept around, it's probably him.
And I'll say, I do think that Ford is much more domestic policy. He does, he's got more foreign policy chops just from having been elected to office, but not particularly. I think the big thing that he's going to be addressing is the first oil shock.
Mm-hmm.
That is a blending of the two. It comes from a foreign affair, but it really hits domestically. And we talked about it earlier, I think, on the 68 episode we did two times ago. I think that really is a big issue that would provide for the opportunity to get some separation, some headlines on his own, rather than just a constant drumbeat of Justice Department hearings.
Yeah. And just to carry us a little bit farther here, one of the things we actually shared some information as we were doing our research before the episode. The 76 election was closer than you may think or remember it to be, for lots of reasons. Basically, there are two battleground states, Ohio and Wisconsin, where the vote is in the case of Ohio is less than 0.3% differential. In the case of Wisconsin, it's slightly less than 2%. The electoral college map there is 297, I think, to 240, with one unfaithful elector who was a Ford elector who ended up voting for Reagan. Now I got to go chase that rabbit now that I know that exists and find out what that's about, because I learned that today. I'm not sure if it means anything, but I learned that today. But the point I'm making is that there are enough electoral votes in Ohio and Wisconsin that if you flip them from one column to the other, you change the outcome of the election. And it can be argued, I think, very strongly, given that Ford was carrying a 71% approval rating before the pardon, basically a 50% approval rating after the pardon, immediate impact of that. Yeah, there's some recovery, but there's nowhere close to any level of recovery that suggests he recovered from that. Could that have flipped 2% of the vote? Absolutely. There had to be at least 2 people out of 100 probably in Ohio going into the voting booth that November that the reason they were not going to give Ford their vote when they may have been willing to otherwise, because they were more aligned with considering themselves Republicans, was exclusively the pardon issue.
Yeah. And even though those are the tipping point states, I think if you want to look at other states, now you have Texas and Hawaii and Mississippi that were also within that margin. So maybe it even wouldn't have been all that close.
Yeah.
With a couple of percent either way.
Well, and then a Ford landslide, or what's perceived as being more of a landslide, that even changes things even more in terms of how that plays, because what happened in the real timeline, of course, is that Republicans lost 53 seats in the House. I mean, it was a major. This wasn't just the flip of the presidency from the Republican column to the Democratic column, but it was, what was going on at the congressional level with a major shift in the dynamics of what was happening there. So, do we think Ford has a legitimate shot without a pardon?
Yes.
I think if Ford, I would say so. I think Ford basically would need to model himself after the sweeper from the Peabody and Sherman intro. He's basically, I'm here to clean up Nixon's mess with my broom and pan. I'm here to just clean that up, and then I will have a presidency of my own, to where he can say, I'm just finishing up Nixon, putting right what went wrong, and then I am here. Because he would be eligible for 2 terms on his own. That's the precedent, I believe, set by LBJ, correct?
He would just miss that, right? Because he serves slightly more than half,
a
right?
term.
Yeah.
So,
I do think it might depend on. I think he probably has a solid chance, but I think the exact nature of how much of a chance he has depends on who he's running against. Because Jimmy Carter doesn't probably come in as the surprise Democratic candidate, because while everybody wants to be anti-Nixon, not just the Democrats.
Right.
So, the question then becomes, who's who of the weird grab bag of 1976 Democrats does Gerald Ford run against, and what does that do to his chances?
I think there's an obvious answer.
Please don't say Wallace.
No,
it's not Wallace.
My favorite American monarchy, I think Ted Kennedy gets into this.
You think Ted Kennedy?
Not in
really?
Not in 76.
No,
I don't think so. I think
probably in 80.
I think it's Scoop Jackson.
You think it's Scoop? I was looking at. I think he's probably the most likely out of the ones who were in the primaries.
So
plus he can run with Mondale and still get the Midwest factor in there still to fight against the Republicans.
Yeah.
Who I have here for 1976, we have Jimmy Carter, Mo Udall of Arizona, Henry M. Jackson of Washington, Jerry Brown of California, George Wallace of Alabama, and then Frank Church of Idaho. For those who got votes for 76.
Is this Jerry Brown? Is this pre-Linda or post-Linda? Where's the Ronstadt element in the Jerry Brown candidacy at this point?
I don't even know what year that was.
But your Carter was uniquely.
That was 79. So this is pre-Linda Ronstadt.
This is pre-Linda. Okay. So, but to the point that was made, Carter is uniquely qualified to be the anti-Nixon. He checks the boxes. He checks multiple boxes being the anti-Nixon, right?
But do we need an anti-Nixon now? You've got
Well,
Ford.
that's where I was about to go, Eric. How important is it? Which I think the argument was being made. You don't need the anti-Nixon, right? You can have something else.
Yeah. So I think, well, maybe Carter still. I mean, Carter wasn't just an anti-Nixon. He was a good anti-Nixon, but he had ideas of his own. So it's not that he was a weak candidate otherwise
Right.
in 76. But I still wonder if Scoop Jackson would have pulled it out. I don't think anybody was going to beat Ford at that point. Like I suspect he would have won in 76. Having said that, Ford might have not relished his second term from 77 to 81 because inflation was worse. His whole idea of whip inflation now from 70, I guess it's probably 75 to 77 didn't work. So inflation was even worse by 78, 79. And so it took a lot of pain to get inflation under control that I don't know if he would have been willing to do. There was still the Iranian issues that we don't really know what would have happened. I mean, let's assume that there still would have been an Islamic revolution. There probably would have been. I don't see any reason why a Ford presidency in 77, 81 would have stopped that. And I also don't think that Reagan would have been any less reluctant to deal with directly with Iranians as a primary opponent, as a general election opponent.
I agree.
So maybe Ford doesn't last one, or maybe Ford only gets one full term before either being primaried by Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
But he can only get one more full term because he's
constitutionally barred.
He's constitutionally barred. So
Yeah.
so let's assume that Reagan gets the Republican nomination in 80. I think that's very likely that there still would have been a Reagan nomination. But now you have a Republican Party that's very much on the ropes, I think.
Yeah, especially after 12 years of power, plus dealing with Nixon.
Yeah.
Plus, there's a lot of stuff that does not go well in the late 70s. I mean, 3 Mile Island is now a Republican disaster too, along with the other stuff. Camp David probably does not happen. I would think. I just don't think that's Ford's priority.
No.
So, if Ted Kennedy runs in 80, he probably is the long-term winner because, he cannot screw anything up hard enough to, get around people just being tired of Republicans for 12 years.
Exactly where I was going, Dylan, is you have a very open field for Ted Kennedy in 80.
I am not willing to concede.
Unless, and now that Senator Kennedy is deceased, this doesn't feel like a bad joke. But unless somebody decides to go 3 for 3 on negative Kennedy presidential campaign outcomes, if you catch my drift.
Yes.
Well, I think it is interesting to I hadn't thought of this as being one of the ripples, but Reagan uniquely benefits by the Carter win in 76, even though Reagan, would run a campaign, before then, in the sense of it's not sustaining, as Eric, you point, I talk about this all the time, the pendulum. It's that, 8 to 12 years, it's going to swing just because it's going to swing, right? And so Reagan has the benefit of being, there's the incumbent is a Democrat. I can run still as a form of outsider that is also of the opposing party as a form of outsider, and the benefits from that. It's a very different rhetoric, I think, of a 1980 Republican Reagan campaign and how that plays out. And then there's even the question of, what endorsement power, who else has risen to the fore in a Ford presidency from 77 to 80, it beginning in 77, continuing on with a win in 76, to maybe be somebody else that represents the non-Reagan element of the party, if the non-Reagan element of the party had any chance at all.
Well, yeah, because now you've got Rockefeller, who's been hiding for long enough. He may be able to make some kind of comeback.
But when did he die?
That's actually what I was about to bring up. Rockefeller dies pretty soon after stepping down as vice. He dies January 26th of 1979.
Okay, never mind. So unless Gerald Ford figures out how zombies work, Rockefeller's out.
Well, then you have Bob
Hey.
Dole. I mean, he was the nominee in '96.
Yeah,
He got clobbered in '96, but
well, that's one of the questions I was going to ask, Eric, is back to even the '76 election now with maybe Ford prevailing. Is Dole still his running mate? You think in '76 under our scenario where we haven't gone through the pardon experience?
I think.
Oh, sorry, Eric. You go ahead.
I don't know. I think so. I think Dole's a good choice on his own merits. And he's a well-respected senator. He was a pretty honest guy. I mean, there's a lot to like about Dole.
I think the other part of it is Ford was generally a domestic person, and whatever actual credence there is to this, there's kind of the sense that war hero equals foreign policy person, and Bob Dole was unmistakably a war hero.
Of course, absolutely. Yeah. There's no question. He was also much more of a mainstream conservative. He wasn't quite as on the sort of the conservative end that Reagan was, but he also wasn't as moderate as Ford was. So Dole did plug some holes that Rockefeller wouldn't plug.
What about Bush? Because I'm looking at the history. He apparently won 8 primaries in '80, and he was a director of the CIA. So, putting aside how you feel about the hostage crisis, that gives him some foreign policy bona fides.
Yeah, well, and I've gone on podcasts and saying that I like H.W. Bush. I think he was a good president.
Yeah.
I don't know that he's quite
Bush
there yet.
Was the other VP pick aside from Nelson Rockefeller. It was between the two of them. Ultimately, Ford went with Rockefeller because Rockefeller had better press with working class voters of color, and those types who typically wouldn't vote Republican. They liked Nelson Rockefeller. The thing I want to bring up is that Rockefeller was kind of forced out. He had been promised like a great wide range of influence, but immediately clashed with Donald Rumsfeld and then Dick Cheney, who were sequentially chief of staff to Ford.
He also got investigated by Congress and had to get a talking to because he somehow didn't think, as a Rockefeller who has more money than God, that maybe giving substantial monetary and financial gifts to members of a current sitting president's cabinet could be seen as potentially trying to buy your way into said cabinet.
Quid pro quo? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That came up early. And the reason I asked the question about Dole was I was trying to think through the scenario here because we've already talked about this, that a President Ford from 77 to 81 is constitutionally barred from seeking the presidency again in 1980. So somebody has to be that incumbent continuance that's not the incumbent. And of course, the logical place that tends to go is the vice president. So that's why I ask about Dole, but who else could have been there? And Eric, I know, I think all of us here have tremendous respect for whether you agree with all of his politics or not. Bob Dole as a person
yes.
is a pretty unimpeachable character. And you can imagine he would have been a strong candidate if he had been the 80 nominee because he was the sitting vice president. The question is, could he have staved off a challenge from Reagan? Because they were different. I think you would have still had Reagan as a primary challenger there, and what would that have looked like, and then how would that have played out moving forward, or some of the other folks that have been mentioned here that could have an H.W. Bush or somebody like that who could have been the vice president and not Dole. What does that play in? How does that play in 80?
I don't think vice president or no. I don't think Bob Dole could have defeated Reagan in the primaries. Bob Dole was many things. He was a war hero. He was a public servant, but he was not particularly charismatic.
Yep.
And you have Reagan, who is very charismatic, who offers a very different vision, that there was a significant population, as we found out in our timeline, of Republicans that were very hungry for, whether you agree or whether you don't agree. President Reagan offered a vision that people liked.
And and we've actually talked about this a couple of times in recent episodes. We the term "great communicator" that's applied there. We think of that we were talking about both in the private realm and in the personal realm, but certainly in the public realm in terms of being able to compel with a speech or compel with a vision. The thing that occurred to me though is the ripple from this potentially is of Ford not pardoning Nixon is Reagan never sniffs the presidency in terms of actually winning it.
Yeah, I don't think he would. I think he might have gotten the Republican nomination in '80, but and I'm assuming John Anderson doesn't run in '80 in this scenario.
Yeah,
I don't know.
And so you get to some point when is Reagan in '84. So much has changed by then. I think we don't know. It's hard to know because the ripples have really played themselves out. But now it's a much older Ronald Reagan in 1984 that would be running versus, Reagan in 76 or even Reagan in 80.
But the one thing I'd say is I think Reagan is, while he may not have had the foreign policy chops, he had the foreign policy ideology chops.
He did.
And I think
true.
In a sense of I'm just remembering an Onion cover from Our Dumb Century. I already see Dylan laughing. It's one of these side by sides of two candidates, and these aren't the two candidates in our time.
I know what you're talking about.
Yes, exactly.
And we're a clean podcast, and so you might want to bleep this out, Don. It's Carter says, let's talk better gas mileage, and Reagan says, let's nuke the bastards.
Yes. And with what's going on in the world, I don't think I think Kennedy in 1980 is running on some of those Cuban Missile memories explicitly on a no, let's not nuke the bastards policy.
He has, well, and to be fair, he had his own, fairly extensive foreign policy experience, but he is very much still relying on his brothers.
And he is not going to be as confrontational.
No.
So none of this works in a vacuum. And I think, with the American perception of having lost Vietnam and the American perception of getting kicked around in Iran, we're really primed for somebody coming in and saying it is morning in America again. We are still a superpower. We are still the shining country on a hill. And you know what? If you don't know who the current president of Egypt versus the current president of Mexico is, that's okay. You hit people in the fields.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and again, by the way, I feel really old sometimes when we're recording episodes here, and I'm not really that old, but relatively speaking, I guess I am at times. But what I'd also remember is, to that point, Morning in America is part of that. Charlie Daniels has a little song that comes out there called "In America." If you've ever heard it, that sort of captured that spirit of that was playing on. I know it was playing on country radio when I was a kid about that time. I presume it was playing other places as well, but it's capturing that, yes, what to do about what to do about gas prices. I think Charlie had an idea in his song, more or less there, the idea was that we're walking real proud and talking real loud again was the thing that's in my head from that. And that was, looking for somebody who could personify that was what a lot of that was about. And again, tremendous respect for former President Carter. Tremendous respect. Arguably, I think the best post-presidency you could argue of anyone in terms of having impact. And there's a lot of good candidates that you could nominate for that thing. But that was not the Jimmy Carter persona, to say the least, that was being portrayed there. So whether you sign a piece of paper when you're the president that has the word pardon across the top somewhere apparently makes a difference here. That's the conclusion that I've drawn from this.
Yes, very much so.
Now,
I will say, Don, we did not start World War III.
Well, there you go. But give Chris time; he'll find a way.
Oh, and by the way, if I may, for somebody who survived 2 assassination attempts in the course of a week, Eric didn't kill him off either.
No, well, okay. So I got to say this. So President Ford gets this reputation, and I blame Chevy Chase, and I'm not a Chevy Chase fan. I blame Chevy Chase, but President Ford was a center for the University of Michigan football team and was drafted. I think it was by both Green Bay and Detroit. He was an athlete.
Yeah.
He was an athlete, and he decided I didn't want to go play football for the NFL. I'm going to go to Yale and go to law school. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to be a coach for the JV team. And by the way, I'm going to do some modeling on the side. Like, I'm sorry, like President Ford was kind of he was kind of a stud. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, he was a BMOC, and then chose to be a big man on Capitol Hill. You know,
he did.
After that.
And he enlisted in 1941 after Pearl Harbor because he's like, okay, I'm gonna give all this up, and I'm gonna go enlist or I'm gonna go join the Navy. He wasn't enlisted; he was an officer. As I recall, he retired from the Navy as an 04. But he did his service to the government, and then he was in the House of Representatives from 1949 until he assumed the vice presidency.
Yeah, and he basically planned to. He said the vice presidency was basically like his good little pre-retirement capstone, and look what we just shoehorned him into, having to do more work for 4 more years.
So President Ford was no lightweight,
and he has the record for the longest living president. He beat Reagan by like 43 days or something.
Well,
the man was like 96 years old.
So
Jimmy
Carter's
Carter
still alive. Jimmy Carter
until Jimmy Carter wants.
Okay.
And Jimmy
Let me
Carter
rephrase that. He's the longest living dead president.
Yeah, well, Jimmy Carter is still alive, God bless him. And if memory serves, I think Jimmy Carter, he is, I don't know if he's 98 or 99.
I want to say 99. Yeah,
maybe
he's
still. He and Henry Kissinger are hanging out. They're sharing secrets. That's what's going on.
Well, Henry Kissinger passed away.
Gone.
Yeah,
Kissinger's gone.
No, you're right.
He made it to 100, but he's gone.
And part of the, I think I'd mentioned that off podcast too, Eric, is that one of the things that don't underestimate the first season of Saturday Night Live and Chevy Chase and his caricature of Ford and having political impact, because I think it did. Later Aykroyd's portrayal of Carter is going to have this starts happening because of this phenomena of humor. Saturday Night Live being maybe the leading edge of that in some ways that's going on there, but to your point, Eric, I think a lot of people knew of Gerald Ford, but they didn't know Gerald Ford because of his path to the vice presidency the way that we know or think about knowing candidates or office holders today. And that probably played against Ford in the real timeline in a mighty way, because I think anybody that knew Gerald Ford sort of would have, that idea we talked about earlier of the corrupt deal would sort of not Gerald Ford. But if you're the public, you don't know Gerald Ford.
You don't know that.
That seed gets planted by somebody who wants to get that seed planted, and your perception of him is what you see on TV, and and then your perception of him is a bumbling Chevy Chase in the first season of Saturday Night Live. That colors your perception of reality versus perception of reality.
I'd say if we've got a more activist Ford, though, maybe that's not the impression.
I agree.
I mean, I've played some line in the past. I feel like John Belushi's more of a center than a Chevy Chase. Like maybe the portrayal is even different.
Yeah, I agree. So one of the things we had talked about off podcast,
I was going to make a joke saying that.
Go ahead, Eric.
Oh, it's a very dumb joke. I was going to say the song "I Got Five on It" by the rap duo Lunas, instead of being about marijuana, it's actually about Nixon on trial, where they just keep asking him, and he's like, "I got the Fifth Amendment."
Maybe we just need to slap an explicit tag on this.
Yeah, we may have to. We may have crossed that line. We hardly ever get near. But one thing we talked about off podcast is we neglected our other show, our companion show, The Room Where It Happened, or The Room Where It Happened. We're going to come back, I think, to some of the topics here in that, because we intentionally steered away from some of the bigger echoes of how this comes down to the present day, or even the discussion of the actual events back in the past, because again, we're alternative history, right? So we need to look at a scenario here where something did or didn't happen. But I think you'll see us revisit this in a context where we can talk more about the what did versus the what didn't in this case, because it's an interesting place to go. And then there's a whole other, all other places we could go, tying back to the echoes to today, because as I mentioned to most of the folks here on the team before, the day this topic was suggested internally happened to be the day that oral arguments were taking place before the Supreme Court, where Richard Nixon's name was invoked frequently because of the questions about pardons and immunities and everything else that went with that. And we didn't get the answers to those questions in the real timeline because of the pardon. And, so talking about, what that meant and what that could have meant, I think is another unique exploration for when we go back. You guys have anything here before we close it out?
I have two things.
Sure.
One, if we're all comfortable with it. So, what do you think Ford do you think Ford was right in pardoning Nixon?
No.
Eric, I agree with you, but would you also agree with me that you understand his logic for doing so, even if you don't agree with his decision?
Absolutely. I absolutely understand his logic. I understand why he did it. I believe that he had honorable intentions with this. I don't think it was corrupt on Ford's part. I think it was just a mistake.
I think if you're going to pardon Nixon, actually, what makes some sense, and it's not a path we talked about, maybe for another episode, is to fall on that sword and say, I am a caretaker. I am going to put all of this behind us, and I will not seek and will not accept the nomination from my party for a term as your president. I'll just be a footnote, but I will stand up and have been, I was president. I'm still going to get that presidential pension, but I don't need another term, and I am going to help America put this behind us.
There is a certain amount of honor in that, Chris. Again, it's hard to completely agree with that, but I also would understand that frame of mind is to view himself as a caretaker.
And Eric, I respect your answer as well. What would have been in your mind the biggest? We know what the negatives would have been. We've talked about them, to Nixon's stand, in terms of what would have been going on and how that. What's the biggest plus we get there?
From him not pardoning, I think you get a very different perception from the public of the amount of corruption that's present in government, and that in some sense there are still some people that are trustworthy in government. I also believe that the pardon of Nixon, got him off the hook in a way that hastened some of our kind of evolution into a more imperial presidency. The presidency is an incredibly powerful position now, and it's always been powerful, but it's incredibly powerful. And I would argue that in some ways, the presidency in its modern conception is tantamount to an elected monarch. They have that level of power, and some of that is because of the nature of the position, and some of it is it's just the influence of our country. I don't know that becomes as prominent as quickly if you have a Nixon that is required to answer for his crimes and is punished for his crimes in some fashion. Because there are subsequent presidents, and we can get into this from the room where it happened. There are subsequent presidents who significantly benefited from this notion of the imperial presidency, but it wasn't Ford directly, nor was it Carter. It was future presidents.
It's further downstream.
Yes,
and there's no doubt about that. And I think it's a fair thing to say, regardless of what your politics is today, it's definitely echoed forward to where we sit right now in terms of what's there. And then you have the other thing that naturally flows from that. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know how to answer that question, Eric, because I see both sides, and I struggle with where to land on it because of the pros and the cons, the divisiveness. what actually could have been healing out of the divisiveness, which is sort of ironic, and that you could have actually had the positive come out because the checks and balances and the idea of the rule of law and all the other things were upheld. Yes, it was messy and nasty and all the other things that it was, but it proves that, to your point, no one is above the law. And that's what it proves. And, and I don't think anyone would have made the argument effectively. People would have made the argument, that Nixon being prosecuted or indicted here was some political indictment. That was not the argument that was going to be made effectively with any widespread sympathetic ears at the time. It would be because of things that he did that were pretty clearly defined. And
it would be hard to argue of a witch hunt from his own party.
Right. Yeah. Well, the person I was thinking of there, I think would be an interesting person even to go back and re-explore here is where's a Howard Baker maybe in all of this, in a different way that this plays out, because, Baker is famous for during the hearings of saying, here's a Republican and was one of the ones who went to Nixon and said, you've got a problem. Is that what did the president know and when did he know it? That was not a member of the opposition party who was asking that question. That was a member of his own party that was asking that question over and over again. And I think that's an interesting thing to contemplate there. Good question from Eric to Eric, the two different Erics in terms of what's there, because I think that's really what this is about is, not just the effect of this hypothetical what if, but the other part of this. What would have happened if it had gone in the other direction? I think it's not as clear cut as you might immediately jump to.
And with Howard Baker, there's another Kansas connection because the senior senator from Kansas during most of my childhood was Bob Dole. The junior senator from Kansas was Nancy Landon Kassebaum Baker. So, who's married to Howard Baker? Just saying, you've invoked both senators during the 1980s.
The problem
the
here,
great state
Eric,
of Kansas.
The problem is, Eric, we just don't have enough Kansas in our national politics anymore. I think that argument can be made.
Well, perhaps not.
I think for me, it always goes back to like what I think of the role of government is just the government is there to do for people what they cannot do for themselves. And as cynical as this sounds, there are times when people are not able to hold their governments responsible in the moment. They have to rely on representatives to do that for them. It's why we have this system that isn't a direct democracy. We have a representative democracy. And so even taking that idea of like, let's say something as simple as the phrase, who watches the watchers? Well, Plato did answer that question. It was supposed to be the watchers who would watch themselves because they would be told that society would crumble if they could not hold themselves to account.
Right.
And that's kind of the twin thoughts of where I come at this of like, as messy as it would have been, I think it would have left the country in a better place with someone so personally unpopular that it haunted him for most of his life, Richard Nixon, that he had a copy of the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, growing up as a child. And we could have had this great case to set just a gold standard of like, we know what is in the wrong, we know what is in the right, we know what is the difference between a political witch hunt and what is our civic duty towards holding up our oaths under office. That's where I come down.
Yeah, well put. All right. If you like this, you're gonna love the live stream. So I'll plug it one more time. Suggest to our listeners visit us at www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. You find information there about the live stream, our past episodes. We've referenced several episodes here you may not have known have existed. Check us out on the Discord server. It heats up there from time to time, and it's getting better. One of the things we've talked about, little cat out of the bag ahead of time, is that I think we're going to try to circle back around once every couple of months, maybe every 6 episodes or so, to what essentially will be a listener feedback, listener mailbag kind of thing, where we're going to be looking to what comes up on the Discord server, because we see some interesting things that happen there. And we reference it a lot because we're reading it and paying attention to it, but maybe not all of our listeners are. So we encourage you to join us for the live stream. Again, that's on May 11th. There'll be information in the show notes. Dylan, I think because of the way you sent me the link, I can include that memorandum because it's a public thing on the internet. So I'm going to throw that into the show notes. You made reference to it earlier about what would an indictment of Richard Nixon potentially have looked like. It looks like that. I'll probably throw some other links to documents in there. I actually want to go back and see the language of the pardon now. So I'll find that online and stick that in there because I think that's an interesting thing to think about as well. So one more time, I'll go around. Any closing thoughts before we close this out here, guys?
No, look forward to continuing this on Rumor It Happened.
Yeah, I do too. All right. So on behalf of Chris, Dylan, Eric, and Eric, this is Don signing off for Fork in Time. And once again, our suggestion always is if you happen upon that fork in history, our advice is to take it. Talk to you in real time next time on the live stream.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.